In 17th century Japan, one samurai's approach to combat was so unique that it challenged everything people thought they knew about winning. In his most famous duel, he defeated Japan's greatest swordsman using nothing but a wooden stick carved from a boat oar. His name was Miyamoto Musashi, and he did something no other samurai warrior had done before. He wrote down his secrets. His book, The Book of Five Rings, completed just before he died in 1645, wasn't just about sword fighting. It revealed principles of strategy so fundamental that they're still studied worldwide nearly 4 centuries later. This is the true story of how a swordsman who began dueling as a teenager developed insights about winning and strategy that would influence generations. Today, we're going to explore what he discovered. It began in a small village in Miyamoto Province, where a boy who would become known as Miyamoto Musashi was born into a world torn apart by civil wars. While historians debate his exact birth year, we know he was born in the late 16th century, during a time of great upheaval in Japan. His father, Munisai, served as a martial arts teacher for the local lord. But life had other plans for young Musashi. His mother died when he was very young, and by age 7, his father was either dead or had abandoned him. Historical records aren't clear which. He ended up in the care of his uncle, a Buddhist monk. Most children in this situation would have been broken by such hardship, but Musashi transformed his pain into an obsession that would make history. While other children played games, he trained with wooden swords from sunrise to sunset. There were accounts from other students describing how this young boy would practice basic sword movements thousands of times until his hands bled. Then he'd wrap them and keep going. But it was what happened next that truly set his path in motion. When Musashi was a teenager, a wandering samurai named Arima Kihei arrived in town. This wasn't unusual. Samurai often traveled around challenging dojos to build their reputation. Arima posted a public notice challenging anyone to a duel. He was an adult, an experienced fighter, confident that no one in this small town could match him. Young Musashi accepted the challenge. Everyone tried to stop the fight. They thought it was a joke. Even Arima tried to back out because killing a child would hurt his reputation, but Musashi wouldn't back down. He formally challenged Arima using his full adult name, a serious matter in Japanese culture. The duel happened at the town center. Arima came with his steel sword, and Musashi brought a wooden staff. Multiple historical sources documented what happened next. Musashi charged in, struck Arima down, and defeated him decisively. A teenage boy had just defeated a grown samurai in front of everyone in town. This victory marked the beginning of Musashi's unique approach to combat. Instead of celebrating, he disappeared for intense self-reflection. He changed his name and left home, beginning a journey spanning decades and reshaping how people thought about strategy. After leaving his village, Musashi spent years wandering throughout Japan, studying different fighting styles and developing his unique approach. During this time, Japan was going through massive changes. The country had just emerged from the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, one of the most significant and decisive battles in Japanese history, where massive armies clashed to control Japan. Musashi himself may have fought in this battle, though historical records aren't completely clear on this. We do know that he was deeply involved in another famous series of confrontations, his battles with the Yoshioka school in Kyoto. This wasn't just one duel, it was a series of encounters that would become legendary. The Yoshioka school was one of the most prestigious martial arts schools in Kyoto, and they had never lost a challenge until they met Musashi. In the first duel, Musashi faced Yoshioka Seijuro, the head of the school. Using only a wooden sword, Musashi defeated Seijuro decisively, forcing him to retire from teaching. The Yoshioka school couldn't accept this humiliation. Seijuro's brother, Denshichiro, challenged Musashi next. This time, Musashi killed him with a single strike to the head. The school made one final attempt. They sent their youngest leader, Yoshioka Matashichiro, but this time with a twist. They planned an ambush. They hid a group of armed men around the dueling ground, but Musashi anticipated this by demonstrating the strategic thinking that would later fill his books. Instead of arriving late as usual, he arrived early, caught them by surprise, killed Matashichiro, and fought through the entire group. After these battles, Musashi focused increasingly on developing and refining his unique two-sword style, Niten Ichi-ryu. It was a complete reimagining of how sword fighting could work. He used a longer sword in his right hand and a shorter sword in his left, creating an unpredictable combination that opponents had never seen before. In his writings, he compared this style to how a carpenter uses both hands while working. Each hand has its role, but they work together seamlessly. Musashi's innovations went far beyond sword techniques. He became skilled in what we'd now call psychological warfare. He understood that mental state was just as important as physical skill in a fight. That's why he often arrived late to duels, dressed poorly, and sometimes appeared unwashed, all calculated decisions to unsettle his opponents before the fight even began. In his book, he wrote that when you get your opponent flustered, they would be taken by the rhythm and will not act as they should. Sasaki Kojiro was renowned for his swallow cut technique, a swift sword movement that could allegedly catch a bird in flight. He wielded an unusually long sword he called the drying pole. The duel was set for early morning. Kojiro arrived on time, prepared for the fight of his life. But Musashi was nowhere to be seen, and hours passed. Kojiro stood in the rising sun, his concentration eroding with each passing moment. Everything, the timing, the waiting, the sun's position, was part of Musashi's strategy. When Musashi finally arrived in a small fishing boat around noon, he carried only a wooden stick he had carved from the boat's oar during the journey. Kojiro, insulted, threw away his scabbard, declaring his intention to fight to the death. Musashi reportedly looked at him and said words that would become legendary. "You've already lost. A man who is prepared only for life and not for death will die with regret." The duel lasted mere seconds. Musashi positioned himself with the sun at his back, timed his attack perfectly, and defeated Kojiro with a single strike from his wooden weapon. He bowed to his fallen opponent and departed without another word. In his later years, Musashi also became renowned for his artistic works. He practiced a style of ink painting called sumi-e, creating masterpieces that are still preserved today. His surviving paintings and artwork, including his striking ink paintings of birds and nature, perfectly captured his philosophy, simple, direct, and powerful. He also excelled in metalwork and craft, designing sword guards, tsuba, that are now considered national treasures in Japan. Perhaps most remarkably, as Musashi aged, he began to see parallels between the arts of war and peace. In The Book of Five Rings, he wrote that the principles of strategy could be applied to everything from large-scale battles to individual combat to business and everyday life. He believed that the way of the warrior and the way of the artist were ultimately the same. Both required absolute presence, clear perception, and decisive action. During his final years, while living in a residence called Regando near Kumamoto Castle at the invitation of Lord Hosokawa Tadatoshi, Musashi focused entirely on passing on his insights. He had only a few dedicated students, but he poured everything he had learned into his teachings and writings. His determination to pass on his knowledge despite his failing health showed a different kind of courage than he had displayed in his duels. The result was the Book of Five Rings, a text that broke down success into 5 fundamental elements: ground, water, fire, wind, and void. Ground represented foundational principles, understanding your position and building from stability. Water taught adaptation, flowing around obstacles and taking whatever form was needed. Fire explained timing and decisive action. Wind addressed traditions and knowing when to break them. Void explored the power of emptiness, understanding that sometimes the most powerful move was no move at all. In his final days, Musashi also wrote The Way of Walking Alone, a collection of 21 principles for life distilled from his decades of experience. Among them was a deceptively simple idea that captured the essence of his philosophy: do nothing that is of no use. These words carried profound weight from a man who had spent his entire life refining his understanding of what truly mattered. Musashi died on June 13th, 1645. In his cave dwelling, they found his final writing, a reflection that revealed his truest victory, the victory over his own ego. He wrote that his early wins weren't due to mastering strategy, but perhaps natural ability or heaven's will. It wasn't until he was 50 that he truly began to understand the deeper principles of strategy. After winning every documented duel, the greatest swordsman in history still believed he had more to learn. That was one of his most valuable lessons. That true mastery wasn't about being unbeatable, but about never stopping your pursuit of deeper understanding. Want to discover more extraordinary historical figures and events? Subscribe. Some incredible stories are coming up.